Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of New Mexico. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1887. New Mexico Territory was still 8 years from achieving statehood, a rugged land of promise and peril. The small settlement of Agua Dulce, approximately 40 miles east of Santa Fe, nestled in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, was unremarkable in most ways. Most ways, except for what transpired at the Ortega family ranch that autumn. The Ortega ranch stood approximately 3 miles north of the settlement, isolated on a stretch of land that was neither particularly fertile nor especially barren. According to county records, Francisco Ortega purchased the 320-acre property in 1872, paying what locals considered an excessive sum for land that offered little beyond solitude. The Ortega family arrived from Spain via Mexico, carrying with them what witnesses described as old money and older secrets. What follows is compiled from territorial records, newspaper clippings from the Santa Fe Daily New Mexican, correspondence between territorial officials, and testimonies collected by Marshal James Cooper during his incomplete investigation. Some details come from the private journal of Dr. Thomas Miller, the only physician within 50 miles, who would later refuse to discuss the case publicly until his death in 1915. Francisco Ortega was described as a man of medium height, with a meticulously groomed beard that had gone gray well before its time. His wife Elena was rarely seen in town. The couple employed 4 ranch hands, all Mexican nationals who lived in a bunkhouse approximately 100 yards from the main house. The Ortegas also employed a housekeeper, Maria Vasquez, who traveled daily from Agua Dulce to the ranch, returning before sunset without fail. In October 1887, Maria Vasquez did not return home. This itself would not have been remarkable. The unpredictable autumn weather in the territory often forced travelers to delay journeys. But Maria had never once stayed overnight at the ranch in her 5 years of employment. Her son, Javier Vasquez, rode to the Ortega property the following morning, only to find the main house empty of all occupants. The ranch hands reported that the Ortegas had received no visitors, that the previous day had proceeded as normal, and that they had observed nothing unusual, except perhaps that the lamps in the master bedroom had burned until dawn. Marshal Cooper's initial report suggested a family emergency had called the Ortegas away, and that Maria had likely accompanied them. This explanation satisfied most residents of Agua Dulce who returned to their daily concerns. The ranch hands continued their duties, expecting the family's return. 3 weeks passed. The Ortegas did not return. Maria Vasquez did not return. Letters addressed to Francisco Ortega from banks in Santa Fe and Albuquerque went unanswered. By November, the territorial governor's office dispatched additional marshals to investigate what was now being treated as a potential crime. What they discovered defied simple explanation. The Ortega home stood in perfect order. No signs of struggle, no evidence of hasty departure. Meals had been prepared but not eaten. Beds had been made with precise hospital corners. Francisco's prized Winchester rifle remained mounted above the fireplace. Elena's jewelry box sat untouched on her vanity, containing pieces worth more than most of the residents of Agua Dulce would earn in a decade. In the kitchen, investigators found Maria's shawl hanging on a peg near the door, as if she intended to retrieve it momentarily. A pot of beans had been left to simmer until the water evaporated and the contents charred. In Francisco's study, a ledger lay open, the final entry dated October 17, 1887, showing a substantial payment to a Dr. H, with no further explanation. The most peculiar discovery came from the ranch hands, who reported that on the night of October 17th they had observed lights moving across the property, not lanterns or torches, but what they described as small stars drifting from the direction of an abandoned mine shaft approximately a mile north of the ranch house. The men had assumed the lights were reflections from the main house, but in retrospect, they insisted the phenomenon was unlike anything they had witnessed before or since. Marshal Cooper interviewed each ranch hand separately. All 4 men provided nearly identical accounts of the Ortegas' daily routines, their business affairs, and their general demeanor. Yet, when pressed about Francisco Ortega's activities in the weeks preceding the disappearance, inconsistencies emerged. 2 men claimed Francisco had spent hours at the abandoned mine shaft. Another insisted he had not left the main house for weeks. The 4th would not speak of Francisco at all, requesting reassignment to another property. According to Santiago Mendez, the oldest of the ranch hands at 57 years of age, Francisco had become increasingly erratic in his behavior, often seen walking the property at night with a brass sextant, taking measurements of the stars. The patron was not himself, Mendez told Marshal Cooper. He spoke less and watched the sky more. Something troubled him deeply. When pressed for details, Mendez could only add that Francisco had ordered the men to avoid the northern section of the property entirely, claiming concerns about unstable ground near the abandoned mine shaft. The second ranch hand, Gabriel Fuentes, contradicted this account. According to his testimony, preserved in territorial records, Francisco had specifically instructed him to assist with clearing debris from the mine shaft entrance in early September. He had me bring mirrors, Fuentes reported, many mirrors of different sizes. Some were very old, with wooden frames carved with symbols I did not recognize. We carried them to the mine, but I was not permitted to enter. The patron said it was not safe, that the air inside might be bad. Fuentes also reported that Francisco had paid him extra to maintain silence about these activities. The third ranch hand, Luis Herrera, claimed to have no knowledge of Francisco's interest in the mine shaft. According to his testimony, Francisco had been entirely focused on ranch business, particularly concerned with the construction of a new stone wall around the main house. This wall, which investigators noted had been left incomplete on the northern side, was unusual in its design. The stones had been arranged not in the typical pattern for stability, but in what appeared to be decorative configurations that made little architectural sense. When shown drawings of the patterns, an archaeologist from Santa Fe later commented that they resembled ancient Anasazi designs found in cliff dwellings throughout the region. The 4th ranch hand, Eduardo Reyes, refused to discuss Francisco Ortega at all. When pressed by Marshal Cooper, Reyes reportedly crossed himself and said only, "Some things should not be spoken of. Some things should not be seen." He requested reassignment the following day and, when denied, abandoned his position without collecting his final wages. He would resurface years later in Santa Fe, as previously mentioned. By December 1887, the investigation had stalled. No bodies were discovered. No evidence of foul play could be established. The Ortegas' banking records showed no unusual withdrawals. Their correspondence revealed nothing beyond ordinary business matters. It was as if the family and their housekeeper had simply ceased to exist. In January 1888, Dr. Thomas Miller approached Marshal Cooper with information he had initially withheld. According to Miller's journal, Francisco Ortega had consulted him 3 times in September 1887 about an unusual condition affecting his wife. Elena had been experiencing periods of cataleptic rigidity, during which she would stand motionless for hours, her eyes fixed on the northern horizon. Francisco had been desperate to keep his wife's condition private, fearing, in his words, that they would find her if they knew. Miller's journal discovered among his effects after his death in 1915 contains more detailed observations than he shared with Marshall Cooper. The doctor had noted that Elena's condition defied conventional medical understanding. The patient exhibits no response to external stimuli during these episodes, he wrote. Pulse and respiration remain normal, yet she appears entirely absent from her physical form. Most disturbing is the state of her eyes, which remain open and unblinking, the pupils dilated to such an extent that the iris is barely visible. When questioned about these episodes after they have passed, Mrs. Ortega claims to have no memory of them, but appears distressed by their occurrence. Miller prescribed laudanum to calm Elena's nerves, but noted that Francisco seemed disappointed with this conventional treatment. In their final consultation, Francisco had asked specifically about mesmerism and whether the doctor knew of anyone practicing it in the territory. Miller did not, but he provided the name of a colleague in Denver who had studied the technique. What Miller omitted from his report to Marshall Cooper, but recorded in his private journal, was Francisco's conviction that Elena's condition was not medical, but something far more disturbing. Ortega believes his wife is, in his words, being called elsewhere, Miller wrote. He spoke at length about theories of consciousness traveling between planes of existence, referencing texts and authors unknown to me. Most troubling was his assertion that during her episodes, Elena speaks in her own voice, but using words she could not possibly know, technical astronomical terms and phrases in languages she has never studied. I suggested the possibility of a mental disturbance, but Ortega dismissed this explanation with unusual vehemence. Miller's journal also records a disturbing encounter with Elena Ortega herself, which occurred when Francisco stepped out of the ER room during their final consultation. Mrs. Ortega grasped my wrist with surprising strength, Miller wrote. Her expression changed entirely, a transformation so complete it momentarily appeared as if I was looking at a different woman altogether. She spoke rapidly in what I believe was Spanish, then switched to English. They sing to me through the glass. They know I can hear them. They are waiting for the door to open. When her husband returned, she released me and resumed her previous demeanor, showing no indication of our exchange. The investigation took a darker turn in March 1888 when Javier Vasquez, Maria's son, broke into the abandoned mine shaft near the Ortega property. His stated purpose was to search for any sign of his mother. What he found instead was a room carved into the rock approximately 15 feet square, containing a single wooden chair bolted to the floor. The walls had been covered with mirrors of various sizes, arranged in no discernible pattern. On the dirt floor, investigators discovered a leather-bound book containing what appeared to be astronomical calculations and diagrams of constellations, particularly detailed renderings of Ursa Major. Marshall Cooper's official report described the room as a peculiar construction without obvious purpose. However, his personal correspondence to the territorial governor, uncovered in state archives in 1952, offered a more candid assessment. I have never encountered a more unsettling space. The mirrors create endless reflections, a disorienting effect that caused several of my deputies to experience severe vertigo. The configuration suggests deliberate design rather than madness, though its purpose eludes me. The chair faces north, positioned such that anyone seated would be visible in every mirror simultaneously. Most disturbing is the sensation, reported by all who entered, that the room is somehow larger than its physical dimensions would allow. The leather-bound book found in the mirrored room contained calculations in Francisco's hand, though, according to experts consulted by Marshall Cooper, many of the formulas employed mathematical principles well beyond what would be expected of a rancher with no formal scientific training. Interspersed among these calculations were drawings, not only of constellations, but of what appeared to be doorways or portals, depicted as standing stones arranged in circular patterns. These drawings were executed with remarkable precision, annotated with measurements and orientations relative to celestial bodies. The book contained a single entry written in what experts from the University of New Mexico would later identify as a cipher combining Spanish and Latin. When decoded in 1896, the message read, "The door opens tonight. Elena will lead us through." The sound is almost too beautiful to bear. Javier Vasquez, who discovered the mirrored room, provided a statement to Marshall Cooper describing what he had experienced. "When I first entered, I thought I had found nothing but a madman's folly. But as I stood surrounded by those mirrors, something shifted. I cannot explain it properly. For a moment I believed I saw my mother's reflection, though I was alone in the room. She appeared to be speaking, but I could hear nothing. When I turned to look behind me, there was no one there. I fled, and will not return to that place." Territorial officials ordered the mine shaft sealed following their investigation. According to the official record, this order was carried out in April 1888. However, local accounts suggest the workers assigned to this task refused to complete it, citing unexplained phenomena, cold spots within the shaft, voices that seemed to emanate from the walls, and most commonly, the sensation of being watched by unseen observers. Eventually, a team was brought in from Santa Fe, men with no knowledge of the Ortega case, who sealed the entrance with dynamite and stone. In April 1888, with no further leads and mounting pressure to resolve the case, territorial officials officially declared Francisco and Elena Ortega and Maria Vasquez missing, presumed dead. The property was auctioned to pay outstanding taxes purchased by a cattle company from Texas whose representative refused to stay in the main house, instead ordering it boarded up until proper authorities can determine its safety for habitation. According to records from the auction, the representative, one Jonathan Byers, initially planned to convert the Ortega house into a headquarters for the cattle operation. However, after spending less than an hour inside the structure, he emerged visibly shaken and immediately changed his plans. When questioned by the auctioneer, Byers would only say, "That house has an atmosphere that does not welcome new occupants." He ordered the building sealed that same day, with all furniture and personal effects left in place. The ranch hands dispersed, 3 returning to Mexico, 1 remaining in New Mexico territory. This man, Eduardo Reyes, would be found dead in 1892 in Santa Fe, his body discovered in a boarding house room he had rented under a false name. The coroner's report listed the cause as heart failure, though several witnesses reported hearing strange music from Reyes's room the night of his death. Among his possessions was a small mirror shard wrapped in a page torn from an astronomical almanac. The landlady of the boarding house, a Mrs. Constance Wheeler, provided a statement that was not included in the official report, but was preserved in local newspaper accounts. According to Mrs. Wheeler, Reyes had been a model tenant until approximately 2 weeks before his death. "He began to act strangely," she reported. "He covered all reflective surfaces in his room, mirrors, windows, even a silver candlestick. He complained of voices calling his name during the night. I suggested he consult a doctor, but he refused, saying they wouldn't understand. The night he died, I heard what sounded like a woman singing in Spanish, though Mr. Reyes lived alone and received no visitors. The page from the astronomical almanac found among Reyes' possessions contained calculations for the position of Ursa Major on October 17, 1887. The mirror shard, when examined by local authorities, appeared to be from one of the mirrors in the room discovered in the mine shaft. How Reyes came to possess it remains unknown, as he was not among those who entered the room during the official investigation. In 1903, history professor William Burke from Boston University traveled to New Mexico to research disappearances in the American West. His interest in the Ortega case led him to the Territorial Archives in Santa Fe, where he discovered photographs of the family that had not been included in the official case file. In these images Burke noted something peculiar about Elena Ortega's appearance. In 3 separate photographs taken over a 5-year period, Elena's eyes reflected light in a manner Burke described as distinctly non-human. Burke attributed this to a photographic anomaly common in early cameras. Burke's research notes, meticulously kept in a series of leather-bound journals, reveal a methodical investigation that went well beyond official channels. He tracked down Santiago Mendez, by then living in El Paso, Texas. The elderly ranch hand, initially reluctant to discuss his former employers, eventually provided Burke with information he had withheld from Marshall Cooper years earlier. According to Mendez, Elena Ortega had changed dramatically following a brief disappearance in December 1886. She went out during a snowstorm, Mendez told Burke. The patron was frantic, searching for 3 days. When she returned, she had no frostbite, no injuries, impossible for someone exposed to such conditions. She claimed to have found shelter, but would not say where or with whom. After that, she was different. The same face, the same voice, but something essential had changed. The patron noticed it too. I heard them arguing at night, him demanding to know where she had really gone, her responses too quiet to make out. And sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, I saw her staring at her own hands as if she had never seen them before. Burke also located and interviewed Dr. Miller, by then retired to a small home outside Albuquerque. Miller, initially reluctant to discuss the case, eventually revealed that Francisco Ortega had been conducting experiments combining astronomical observation with what he called the ancient science of mirrors. According to Miller, Ortega believed that certain alignments of stars created windows through which one could glimpse other worlds. More disturbing, Ortega had become convinced that his wife was not, in fact, Elena, but something that had returned through one such window wearing Elena's form. Miller showed Burke a letter he had received from Francisco just 1 week before the disappearances. The letter, which Miller had kept hidden for 15 years, contained passages that the doctor considered too disturbing to share with authorities. I have confirmed my suspicions, Francisco wrote. The being that wears my wife's face is not Elena. During her episodes, I have tested her with questions only Elena could answer, childhood memories, private moments between us, and she fails consistently. Yet she possesses knowledge Elena could not possibly have. Last night I showed her a book of astronomical calculations, and she corrected my work without hesitation, identifying an error in computations that took me weeks to develop. When I asked how she knew, she smiled in a way that made my blood run cold and said, "We have always known the paths between stars. I am now certain Elena is elsewhere, and something else walks in her form. I believe I know how to reach the place where she has been taken. May God forgive what I must do to bring her home." Burke's research was never published. His notes, discovered after his sudden death in a hotel room in 1905, were considered too fantastical for academic publication. They were archived by Boston University until 1963, when graduate student Rebecca Morton discovered them while researching her dissertation on frontier justice systems. The circumstances of Burke's death deserve particular attention. According to the Santa Fe police report, Burke was found in his hotel room, seated in a chair facing a wall mirror. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, though the examining physician noted several unusual factors. Burke's eyes were open, fixed on his own reflection. Rigor mortis had set in with remarkable rapidity, and most peculiarly, the mirror showed signs of what appeared to be frost on its surface, despite the warm temperature of the room. Burke's final journal entry, written the night of his death, read only, "I see her now, watching from behind the glass. She is not Elena Ortega. She never was." Rebecca Morton's interest in the Ortega case began as academic curiosity, but quickly became something more personal. Her dissertation notes, preserved in the University of New Mexico archives, reveal a gradual shift from scholarly detachment to intense fascination. "The Ortega disappearance represents more than a frontier mystery," she wrote. "It suggests a rupture in our understanding of reality, a case where the most rational explanation may be one that defies rationality itself." Morton's attempts to follow up on Burke's research led her to the former Ortega property, by then owned by the Cooper Ranch Corporation. The main house had been demolished in 1926, but the foundation remained visible. Morton obtained permission to conduct a limited archaeological survey of the site, focusing on the area where Francisco's study had been located. Her findings, documented in field notes but excluded from her dissertation, included a sealed metal container buried approximately 3 feet beneath where the study floor would have been. The container held a journal written in Francisco Ortega's hand dating from January to October 1887. The contents described Francisco's growing concern that the woman living in his house was not his wife. According to the journal, Elena had gone missing for 3 days in December 1886 after wandering out during a snowstorm. When she returned, she appeared physically unchanged, but exhibited subtle behavioral differences that only a husband would notice. She no longer feared spiders. She hummed melodies Francisco had never heard before. Most disturbing, she spent hours staring at the night sky, particularly at Ursa Major, and speaking in what Francisco described as her voice, but not her words. The journal detailed Francisco's desperate research into potential explanations. For his wife's transformation, he consulted medical texts, religious authorities, and eventually more obscure sources. "I have obtained a manuscript from a collector in Mexico City," he wrote in April 1887. "It describes ancient Aztec beliefs regarding star beings who could assume human form by capturing a person's reflection. The manuscript claims these entities seek doors between worlds, using mirrors as thresholds. I would dismiss this as superstition, but it aligns too closely with what I have observed in Elena." Francisco's later entries documented his correspondence with individuals identified only by initials: Dr. H. in Denver, Professor S. at a university in Vienna, and most frequently, A.M., somewhere in New Mexico territory. These communications led him to develop what he called a theoretical framework for interdimensional transit, a system combining precise astronomical alignments with optical configurations that could, he believed, open a pathway to wherever his true wife had been taken. The final entry, dated October 16, 1887, read, "I have failed to bring Elena back. The creature wearing her form has agreed to show me where she has gone. Maria has prepared the room as instructed. The alignment occurs tomorrow night. May God forgive me for what I must do." Morton's discovery prompted renewed interest in the case, but by 1963 no living witnesses remained. The abandoned mine shaft had collapsed in a territorial earthquake in 1918. The house was gone. The only physical evidence remaining was Francisco's journal, which was transferred to the New Mexico State Archives in Santa Fe, where it remained until it was reported missing in 1968. Morton herself became part of the mystery. Following her discovery, she began experiencing phenomena she described in her personal journal as bleed-through from elsewhere. She reported seeing reflections move independently of her own movements, hearing voices speaking in Spanish and other languages she could not identify, and most disturbing, dreaming of a woman she believed to be Elena Ortega, standing in a field of stars, beckoning to her. Morton's academic advisors grew concerned when she began to miss appointments and submit work that increasingly focused on the Ortega case rather than her stated dissertation topic. In March 1964, Morton was found in her apartment in a catatonic state, staring at a wall covered with small mirrors she had arranged in a pattern matching the configuration described in the mirrored room in the mine shaft. She was institutionalized briefly at the New Mexico State Hospital, where she was diagnosed with acute schizophrenia triggered by academic pressure. Upon her release, she abandoned her academic career entirely and reportedly moved to Alaska, where she felt the stars were less threatening. In 1967, astronomer Dr. James Winters from the University of Arizona published a paper analyzing Francisco Ortega's astronomical calculations found in the mirrored room. Winters concluded that Ortega had been tracking a previously unrecorded celestial event, a precise alignment of stars in Ursa Major that occurs once every 127 years. This alignment had indeed occurred on October 17, 1887, and would not occur again until 2014. Winters's paper attracted little attention outside astronomical circles. However, his research notes included a curious observation he chose to omit from his published work. The mirrored room in the mine shaft had been positioned at precisely the correct angle to reflect the light from this specific stellar alignment. More intriguing, the arrangement of mirrors would have created an optical effect known as infinite regression, potentially amplifying whatever light entered the space. In correspondence with a colleague at Caltech, discovered after Winters's abrupt retirement in 1968, the astronomer expressed disturbing personal experiences that followed his study of Ortega's calculations. "I find myself unable to look at the night sky without dread," he wrote, "particularly when Ursa Major is visible. I have begun to hear something in the intervals between thoughts, a sound like distant singing, in a voice that resembles my wife's but speaks words I cannot understand. Last night I covered all mirrors in our home. Catherine thought I was having a nervous breakdown, but when I explained, she admitted she too had been experiencing unusual reflections, seeing movements at the corner of her eye that vanish when viewed directly. I am considering the possibility that by replicating Ortega's calculations, I have somehow drawn attention from whatever he encountered. I will be destroying my notes and recommend you do the same with any copies in your possession." The Ortega case was officially closed in 1968, with the disappearances remaining unsolved. The file was microfilmed and stored in federal archives, the original documents reportedly destroyed in a small fire that affected only that particular storage cabinet. The land where the Ortega Ranch once stood remains undeveloped. Local residents avoid the area, claiming the ground never quite freezes there in winter. Hikers occasionally report hearing what sounds like distant conversation in Spanish, though no source is ever found. In 1991, a geology student collecting soil samples near the collapsed mine shaft reported finding a small hand mirror of antique design. When she attempted to use it, she claimed to have seen not her own reflection, but that of a woman with eyes like pools of night. The mirror was reportedly lost when the student's backpack went missing during her return journey. The student, Melissa Harding, later provided a more detailed account to a local newspaper, though the story was relegated to the unexplained phenomena section typically featured around Halloween. The woman in the mirror was both beautiful and terrifying, Harding stated. She had Elena Ortega's features. I recognized her from the photographs I'd seen while researching the area's history, but her eyes were wrong. Completely black, with points of light like stars visible in their depths. She spoke to me, asking if I would open the door. When I asked what door, she smiled and said, "The one you carry with you always." I dropped the mirror and ran. When I returned to retrieve my equipment, everything was gone, not just the mirror, but my entire backpack with all my samples and notes. Perhaps most unsettling are the reports from the Cooper Ranch, which borders the former Ortega property. Since the 1950s, ranch hands have reported occasional sightings of a woman in 19th-century dress walking toward the north at dusk. The figure never responds to calls and disappears when approached. Current owner Michael Cooper dismisses these stories as folklore, but admits that cattle refuse to graze on the portion of his property nearest the old Ortega land. In a 1987 interview with the Santa Fe New Mexican, conducted for a centennial retrospective on unsolved territorial cases, Cooper acknowledged the persistent rumors but offered a rational explanation. That land has different soil composition, likely higher mineral content that affects the taste of the vegetation. Animals are sensitive to such things. As for the ghost stories, well, every ranch in New Mexico that's been around more than 50 years has at least one. It's part of the culture. That said, we don't use that north section at night, not because of superstition, mind you, but because the terrain is treacherous in the dark. The reporter noted, however, that Cooper appeared uneasy when discussing the property, and that during their tour of the ranch, he deliberately avoided the area in question, viewing it only from a distance. When pressed, Cooper admitted that he had once, as a young man, ventured onto the former Ortega land alone. "I didn't see any ghosts," he said, "but I did experience something unusual. The air felt different there, heavier somehow, and though it was a clear day, the stars were visible, as if night and day were somehow overlapping. I heard singing, too distant to make out the words. I told myself it was just the wind, but—" He did not complete the thought and changed the subject. In 1955, anthropologist Evelyn Santos from the University of New Mexico interviewed elderly residents of the area about local legends. One man, who claimed his grandfather had known Francisco Ortega, shared a story passed down in his family. According to this account, Ortega had not been studying astronomy, but attempting to contact beings he believed lived in the spaces between stars. The man's grandfather had once overheard Elena telling Maria Vasquez that she sometimes heard singing coming from the mirrors in her bedroom, voices that sounded like her own, but speaking words she didn't understand. Santos's field notes, preserved in the university's anthropology department archives, contain additional details not included in her published work. The elderly man, identified only as Mr. C., reported that his grandfather had been employed briefly at the Ortega Ranch in early 1887, but had left after less than a month. "My grandfather said there was something wrong with the mistress of the house," Mr. C. told Santos. "He said sometimes her shadow didn't move with her, like it was watching her instead of following her, and he claimed the master was afraid of her. Not like a man who fears violence, but like someone who knows he's speaking to something wearing a familiar face. My grandfather was a practical man, not given to fancies, but he refused to set foot on that property again, even years after. The family disappeared." Santos also documented a local folk tale that had emerged around the Ortega case, a cautionary story told to children about La Mujer del Espejo, the woman in the mirror. The tale warned against staring too long into mirrors at night, especially when Ursa Major was visible in the sky, lest the woman take your reflection and use it to enter our world. Some versions of the story specifically mentioned the stars as doorways and claimed that the woman sought to bring others back to the place between reflections, where she truly lived. The final documented reference to the Ortega case comes from the Journal of Night Watchman Samuel Hill, who worked at the New Mexico State Archives from 1965 to 1969. In an entry dated September 30th, 1968, Hill described an unusual occurrence during his rounds. He claimed to have heard a woman's voice coming from the secure room where Francisco Ortega's journal was stored. The voice was speaking rhythmically in Spanish, repeating what sounded like coordinates or directions. Hill, who did not speak Spanish, could not transcribe what he heard, but he noted that the voice fell silent precisely at 3:17 a.m. The following morning, Ortega's journal was discovered missing. Hill's employment was terminated shortly after this incident, officially due to budget cuts. However, internal memos suggest the true reason was concern about his mental stability. Before leaving his position, Hill provided a written statement to his supervisor, insisting that what he had experienced was real. "I know what I heard," he wrote, "and I know what I saw when I looked through the window into that room. There was a woman standing there, though I had locked the door myself at the end of the previous shift. She was dressed in clothing from another century, and she was holding the Ortega journal. When she saw me watching, she smiled, not a friendly expression, but something calculating. Then she did something to the mirror on the wall. I can't explain what exactly, but it seemed to open somehow. She stepped through it, taking the journal with her. I know how this sounds, but I swear on my life, it's what I witnessed. What happened to Francisco and Elena Ortega and Maria Vasquez on October 17, 1887? Were they murdered? Did they flee? Or, as Francisco's recovered journal suggested, did they attempt to open a door that should have remained closed? The official's record offers no conclusion. The mirrors from the mine shaft were distributed to various territorial officials as curiosities, their significance unrecognized. The calculations and star charts were archived and forgotten until Dr. Winters' brief interest nearly 80 years later. A curious footnote to the case emerged in 1974, when renovations to an old government building in Santa Fe uncovered a sealed cavity in a wall. Inside was one of the mirrors from the mine shaft room, wrapped in oilcloth and accompanied by a note written by Marshall Cooper himself. The note, dated April 1888, read simply, "This object should not be destroyed, but neither should it be used. Keep it covered and away from direct starlight." The mirror was transferred to the New Mexico History Museum, where it remained in storage, uncatalogued, until a routine inventory in 2003 revealed that it had vanished from its container. No explanation for its disappearance was ever determined. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the case is its pattern of affecting those who investigate it too deeply. William Burke in 1905. Rebecca Morton, whose promising academic career ended when she suffered a psychological breakdown in 1964, reportedly after waking to find all the mirrors in her apartment had been rearranged. Dr. Winters, who abandoned astronomy entirely after completing his analysis of Ortega's calculations, refusing to explain why he would no longer look at the night sky. In 1968, shortly before the Ortega file disappeared, a night janitor at the archives reported finding a message scratched into a bathroom mirror. "The door remains open. We are still waiting." The message was dismissed as vandalism, the mirror replaced. In 1982, a graduate student researching territorial legal history came across references to the Ortega case and became intrigued enough to visit the former ranch site. According to his roommate, the student became increasingly paranoid in the weeks following his visit, covering all reflective surfaces in their apartment and refusing to go out at night. He left a single journal entry describing his experience. "I felt watched the entire time I was there, not by anything visible, but by something observing from just beyond perception. When I looked at my reflection in my car's rearview mirror, I saw someone else looking back, a woman with Elena Ortega's face but eyes that contained the night sky. She spoke to me. She said they've been patient, but the alignment approaches again. She said they have been reaching through every reflection, trying to prepare the way. I will not look into another mirror. I cannot risk seeing her again." The student withdrew from the university the following semester and could not be located for comment when interest in the case resurged in the early 2000s. In 2013, as the date of the next 127-year stellar alignment approached, a team of paranormal investigators attempted to conduct research at the former Ortega property. They were denied access by the Cooper Ranch management, citing safety concerns. The team instead set up equipment at the nearest public access point, approximately half a mile from where the ranch house had stood. Their overnight vigil yielded audio recordings that, when analyzed, appeared to contain a woman's voice speaking, in both Spanish and English, though the words were largely indecipherable. The most clearly audible phrase, captured just after 3:05 a.m., was, "The door opened soon. Will you see us coming through? The investigators reported equipment malfunctions throughout the night, particularly affecting cameras and any devices with screens or reflective surfaces. Most disturbing was their discovery, upon returning to their hotel, that all photographs and video they had attempted to capture showed only distorted images of stars, regardless of where the cameras had been pointed. The team's leader, paranormal researcher David Kaufman, later wrote that he would not return to the site, stating, "In 15 years of investigating allegedly haunted locations, I have never experienced such a profound sense of wrongness. This is not a case of restless spirits or residual energy. Whatever exists in that location is active, aware, and fundamentally different from anything I have encountered elsewhere. The Ortega Ranch is gone now. The mine shaft has collapsed. The mirrors have been scattered, lost, or destroyed. All that remains are fragments of a mystery, disconnected pieces that form an image too disturbing to fully assemble. Perhaps that is for the best." In 2014, when the stellar alignment Francisco Ortega had calculated would occur again, astronomers at the McDonald Observatory in Texas reported an unusual phenomenon visible only through specialized equipment. For approximately 17 minutes, the stars of Ursa Major appeared to emit light at wavelengths outside their normal spectral range. The anomaly was documented, but defied explanation through conventional astrophysics. No connection to the Ortega case was made officially, though one researcher, upon learning of the historical coincidence, requested a leave of absence and reportedly moved to South America shortly thereafter. That same night, 3 separate individuals in northern New Mexico, unknown to each other and with no knowledge of the Ortega case, reported strikingly similar experiences. Each described waking at precisely 3:17 a.m. with the sensation of being watched. Each observed what appeared to be a woman's face visible in darkened windows or mirrors, though no reflection should have been possible without light. And each reported hearing a woman's voice speaking the same phrase, "The door is open. We are coming through." Local authorities dismissed these reports as mass hysteria triggered by social media discussions of the astronomical event. The official explanation cited the power of suggestion and the human tendency to pattern match coincidental phenomena. This rational perspective was embraced by most who heard of the incidents. After all, the alternative was too unsettling to contemplate. A final disturbing coda to the Ortega mystery emerged in 2015, when a nursing home resident in Albuquerque claimed to be Rebecca Morton, the graduate student who had discovered Francisco Ortega's buried journal in 1963. The elderly woman, whose identity could neither be confirmed nor refuted due to lost records, insisted on speaking with a historian from the University of New Mexico. When a junior faculty member was sent to humor what was presumed to be a confused senior citizen, she provided details of the Ortega case that did not appear in any published accounts, but matched archival records not accessible to the public. According to the faculty member's written account of their conversation, the woman claiming to be Morton said, "I've been hiding since 1964, changing my name, staying away from mirrors, avoiding the night sky. But it doesn't matter, they found me anyway. They always find those who know about the door. They're patient. They have all the time in the universe. I see her standing behind you now, wearing Elena's face, but with those terrible star-filled eyes. She's smiling. She knows I can see her. She knows I'll be joining them soon." The faculty member reported seeing nothing unusual in the room. The elderly woman died in her sleep that night. An attendant who discovered the body reported that all reflective surfaces in the room, the mirror, the television screen, even the water glass by the bed, had been covered with articles of clothing or bed sheets. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. Some knowledge, once gained, cannot be forgotten. And sometimes, when you gaze long enough into a mirror, something gazes back, something wearing a face you almost recognize as your own. If you find yourself in northern New Mexico, near where the Ortega Ranch once stood, residents advise against remaining after sunset. They cannot explain why, just that no one does. And if you happen to carry a mirror, they suggest keeping it covered, especially when the stars of Ursa Major shine overhead. After all, as Francisco Ortega discovered too late, not all reflections show us what is really there. Sometimes they show us what waits on the other side, watching for an invitation. To cross over, the Ortega case remains officially unsolved. The disappearances of Francisco and Elena Ortega and Maria Vasquez are listed in territorial records as one of the many mysteries of the American frontier, attributed variously to foul play, flight, or misadventure in the unforgiving landscape. The more unusual elements of the case have been relegated to local folklore, dismissed by serious historians as embellishments added over decades of retelling. Yet the land where the ranch once stood remains undeveloped more than a century later. Satellite imagery shows the property as an irregular dark patch amid the surrounding ranch land, an area where, for reasons no one can quite articulate, nothing is built, no cattle graze, and even wildlife seems scarce. In 2018, a surveyor working for a development company that had purchased portions of the Cooper Ranch reported an anomaly in the soil composition near the former Ortega property. Ground-penetrating radar revealed what appeared to be a geometric structure approximately 20 feet beneath the surface, a perfect cube, approximately 15 feet on each side, with no visible entrance or exit. When drilling equipment was brought to the site to take core samples, it reportedly malfunctioned repeatedly. The development plans were eventually abandoned, citing environmental concerns that were never specified publicly. The company's lead surveyor later told colleagues that he had experienced something unexplainable while taking final measurements at the site. According to witnesses, he refused to elaborate, saying only, "Some things should stay buried. Some doors should remain closed." He resigned his position shortly thereafter and moved to Hawaii, reportedly telling friends he wanted to be somewhere surrounded by water, as far as possible from the New Mexico desert. For those who know where to look, the echoes of the Ortega mystery continue to reverberate through historical records, academic footnotes, and local legends. Each investigator who approaches the case seems to retreat, leaving behind fragmentary warnings that go largely unheeded. Each generation rediscovers the story only to abandon it again, disturbed by implications too profound to comfortably contemplate. Perhaps Francisco Ortega found what he was looking for on that October night in 1887. Perhaps he rescued his wife from whatever had taken her place. Or perhaps he joined her in some realm beyond our understanding. Perhaps Maria Vasquez was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, drawn into a boundary crossing she neither sought nor understood. Or perhaps there is a simpler explanation: mundane violence, deliberate disappearance, a conventional crime obscured by the passage of time and the accumulation of folklore. Those who have studied the case most deeply tend to avoid such certainties. They speak instead of boundaries between worlds that may be more permeable than we care to admit. They note the recurring patterns, astronomical alignments, reflective surfaces, distortions of identity. They point to the consistent experiences reported by those who have investigated too thoroughly: the sense of being watched through mirrors, the woman with star-filled eyes, the voices that sound familiar but speak unknown words. And they offer a simple piece of advice, passed down from Marshall Cooper's time to our own. Be careful where you look too deeply. Be mindful of what might be looking back. The stars of Ursa Major continue their slow procession across the night sky. Mirrors continue to reflect what stands before them, usually. And somewhere in northern New Mexico, a patch of land remains empty, undisturbed by development or cultivation, as if the very earth remembers what transpired there and refuses to entirely surrender its secrets. The next 127-year alignment calculated by Francisco Ortega will occur in 2141. Perhaps by then, the story will have faded entirely from memory. Perhaps the warnings will go unheeded, the patterns unrecognized. Or perhaps someone will remember. We'll connect the astronomical event to the historical mystery. We'll visit the site with mirrors and instruments. We'll attempt once more to open a door that should remain closed. Until then, the Ortega case waits in dusty archives and local ghost stories, a mystery without resolution, a warning without context. And somewhere, perhaps, Elena Ortega waits as well, behind the glass, beyond the stars, watching with infinite patience for the next door to open. The Ortega case remains officially unsolved.